Welcome to this bonus episode of Tree Lady Talks. Here at Tree Lady Talks, we want to keep you, our lovely community, updated with what's happening. And here in the UK, long awaited, there is a revision of our main British standard to do with trees and construction, the BS 5837. Trees in relation to design, demolition and construction. And currently we're working under 2012. And prior to that was 2005. And prior to that was 1991. And the first one was in 1980. But things are moving so fast, aren't they? Regular listeners will have heard so many great people speak about all the changes that are happening. And we need a new British standard to really guide us through that. And this document, for those who aren't in the UK, as you know, we're a really highly regulated country here. And this document is fundamental to ensuring good tree care on development sites when it's implemented properly. And so us ARBs in the UK have just been waiting and waiting for this document to come out. And here it is. So it's out for consultation until October the 16th. But we are absolutely thrilled and privileged to have with us the chair of the committee who are proposing these changes. And this committee sits in the wider Committee for Trees, which is the B213 committee, chaired by friend of the show, Julian Forbes Laird. But this subcommittee is really under the spotlight now. And so we're really grateful that Howard Booth, chair, is here today. Howard, welcome.
Hi there.
Howard, we're so excited about this. Now, I'm going to try and control myself, okay? Because normally in Tree Lady Talks, I'm giving my views right, left, and centre. But I'm not going to be doing that today because it's really over to you because our listeners want to know the changes. So, what I love about this document, that's an opinion straight away, isn't it? But it's not on what's in it, is that you set out in the executive summary the main changes. So I thought it might be an idea to go through those one by one. So the first change is a new series of process flow charts. Could you tell us about those, please, and what the thoughts were behind it?
Yeah, so the flow charts effectively guide you through the process, and the British standard, to some extent, there are two elements to it. One is setting out a process to follow with different stages and how those could be approached. And then the specifics that underpin that, setting out sort of specifics around how to categorise trees, how to measure and set out the constraints of trees. So there's an element of standardisation for output, but also a standard process. The 2012 version sets out in quite a lot of detail in one very large flow chart all the different stages and steps, and that's been simplified to an overall flow chart at the start, which then takes through the different clauses of the standard. The sort of inspiration or sort of what triggered those flow charts was to make it easier for users to engage with it and to follow it, and inspiration in part from BS 8545, which uses exactly the same process in its structure.
The other thing, that there's parity with the Royal Institute of British Architects, the REBA work stages. So each individual flowchart references the work stage. So I'm guessing the thinking behind that is to make it, to speak a common language with our peer professionals. Is that right?
Yeah, it is to provide structure that aligns with other industries. So arboriculturists and all set out on their own. There is a structure and a format to align with. There's also within those flowchart diagrams a list of sort of professions or types of people that should or could be involved at those stages as well, which reinforces that arboriculturists are part of a design team, either for developers or within local planning authorities, working with their peers to understand and assess what's happening.
Okay, so when should we get appointed in accordance with the latest iteration of the British Standard that you're proposing?
It's as early as possible.
Yeah.
That's something that I think, as an industry, arboriculturists have been trying to do for years and years, and it's hit and miss. Some projects get us in right at the very start with that ability to really inform and influence design, layout, and inform master planning. So that's the best stage to get involved.
Because I think it's important for the listeners who don't know you. You are a jobbing arb, as I would put it. You are a professional arboriculturalist working in this field, aren't you?
Yeah, the sort of over 20 years split between the public and private sector, managing and advising on trees. So yeah, trees is very much me.
And you know, you're not doing this on your own. You have a committee group of peer professionals as well, don't you?
Yeah, so the drafting panel for the standard, um, there's 9 people in total, and it's been a blend of arboriculturists, both consulting and local authority, as well as landscape architects who can draw on their experiences and their understanding, as well as designers in the sort of architect sphere as well. So we've got a blend of different people with backgrounds, ranging from relatively small projects through to some of the biggest in the country.
And how long have you been working on this as a committee?
Oh, so the committee, I suppose if I go back, the B213 Trees Committee decided in May 2002 it was appropriate to revise the British Standard. And that's a quinquennial decision, so every 5 years British standards are reviewed by their committees. So it was agreed to revise it. I was appointed chair then, worked through business plan. There was the initial consultation around the intent to revise the standard, and then it was early 2023 that the drafting panel was formed and started meeting started off monthly, and then it was every other month, working through to figure out the detail of what was needed and how to make it work.
So a year and a half's work, 9 people plus yourself, and here we are. The next change I want to talk to you about appears to me to be a very small change. So currently the British Standard, in terms of surveying, asks us to measure trees measured at 1.5 metres from the ground to the trunk, and there's various detail about multi-stem trees as well. But at the moment it's 1.5 metres, but you're proposing 1.3 metres. So I personally, as a woman who's just average height, it's probably a bit easier for me. But tell me your thoughts behind that as a committee.
Yeah, so there's a bit of history. The original standard in 1980 measured trees at 1.4 metres above ground. In 1991, it then became 1.5 metres, and that would have aligned with the Town and Country Planning Act for conservation areas, which in 1991 set 1.5 metres. So from development construction, that all makes perfect sense. But we measure trees for many different reasons, and there are many different sort of systems, processes, and regulation. So 1.3 metres is what is used to measure trees for a felling licence to establish the volume of timber. It's the reference height for the duty to consult where highway trees need to be removed. It's also the height at which English Nature, in their documents around veteran trees, uses the height, and more recently BNG, Biodiversity Net Gain, also aligns with 1.3 metres. So given so much measures or uses the diameter at 1.3 metres, it makes sense that this British standard aligns with that to sort of streamline and make it simpler.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, I can see the logic behind that. Now, the other thing that's very interesting to me is you are slightly changing the categorization method. So, one of the strengths of the British Standard is that there are key things about it which are widely understood and referred to by non-arboriculturalists during the construction phase, and the pre-planning phase. So, one of those is the categorization, where currently we have A being very high quality, B moderate, C low value, and U unsuitable for retention. But that it is changing, so tell us how, and then tell us why.
Yeah. So, so the the importance of veteran trees has sort of increased over time.
As I've
So,
got older, joke, sorry.
but given their importance in planning decision making and policies, they are effectively decided upon first. So if a tree is a veteran tree, then it's given its own classification. And that distinguishes it separately from all the other high quality trees. So at the moment, the current standard, category A includes veteran trees plus other very good quality trees. So differentiating those is proposed with the category V. The
That's V for
introduction,
veteran.
yeah, that's correct. And what the standard has intentionally avoided is introducing a new definition for veteran trees.
Oh, yes,
So
I think we've already got potentially too many. And for those who are wondering what I'm talking about, there is an episode a few weeks ago with Julian Forbes Laird on the different definition of veteran trees, particularly in relation to biodiversity net gain. And our already recorded next episode is with a principal ecologist, Simon Thomas, also on this very subject. So, yeah, do carry on, Howard.
yeah, so not wanting to muddy the waters further with definitions for veteran trees, the standard sets out that you should effectively refer to, if you're in England, you'd go to National Planning Policy Framework for the definition in the context of planning. In Scotland, that's NPF3, was it 4? But they're different definitions across the different nations. So should use what's appropriate to the project. So once the category V, the veteran trees, have been established, the next question is, so what are the trees that are really not going to last very long? Relatively short-term trees, currently category U. In principle, it's the same description for those, but the label is changed to category X, and the reason for that is relatively simple in that letters V and letter U can be mixed up for one another.
Oh,
I'd
that's
like to think it doesn't
true.
happen too often, but there's logic behind some of these little small tweaks.
Oh, no, that's absolutely true. Yes, I can see that. I mean, it used to be, I've been an absolute pedant now, a bit of a nerd. It used to be category R in the 2005, and then it changed to category U in 2012, and now it's changed into category X. There is also something rather neat about that in terms of understanding that cross means crossing out, removing. There's something deeper than just the letter X as well.
And they're
Okay.
also excluded from assessments such as the Canopy assessment, given they're not there long term.
Yes, yes. Of course, there is that tension with biodiversity net gain, but that's not going to be the subject of this podcast because this is an information on how things are changing. So we've said, is it a veteran? Oh, that's a big subject. Is it a category X? Well, there you go. So what are you left with?
And then you're left with the majority of trees, to be honest. The majority of trees don't fall into either of those. And to aid designers, there's the differentiation between the higher quality, higher priority trees, and we've kept the A, B, and C categories. How they're decided would be different. So rather than the 2012 version of a cascade chart where you start at the top and work your way down, a lot of people didn't do that. They just cherry picked and they go where they wanted, and that's the correct definition. It fits this, even if one's further up may be more appropriate. So the starting assumption now is that all trees start at category B. So they're all starting off as a moderate quality tree, and then based on their attributes, they might be increased to category A or reduced to category C, and that's a decision that's made on balance. And one of the reasons is that it's not designed to be abused, but it's designed to be flexible, because trees are hugely variable. No two are the same. And there needs to be flexibility in a categorization system to enable for all those different issues and factors to be thought through by an arboriculturist to understand how important these trees should be for designers.
So we have V at the top of the chain, X at the bottom, then A, B, C. In the current iteration, A, B, and C had subcategories 1, 2, and 3. 1 being mainly arb, 2 being landscape, 3 being historic or ecological importance. Is that still the case, Howard?
So those subcategories as numbers don't exist going forward, but it's recommended that the rationale for the categories is recorded. So a list of factors that could increase or reduce those categories is provided, and those could be used to reference the rationale behind the decision making.
In the current version of the British Standard, in the cascade chart, there's a correlation between A, B, and C and life expectancy, which always gave me a personal problem in terms of I didn't think the two necessarily sat together. Is that still the case?
I suppose in the simple answer is no. You'd still want trees that you're investing lots of time and effort to retain to be trees that have longevity. So they should really have, you'd probably want at least 30 years. But the cut off, I suppose those age bands is changed, and it's sort of simplified. And the further you look into the future, the harder it is to predict. There's just
Of
so many
course.
variables. And to some extent, it aligns with BNG as well. Is 30 years is the time reference for BNG conditions. So there's some alignment with that being put in place.
And what about the colours? The colours of the categories, are they the same? What's V going to be? Oh, I think it's A is still light green, isn't it? B is still mid blue. C is still grey with the RGB numbers. X is now red. And V is a light blue, isn't it? Is that
Yeah,
right?
the light blue is to pop out a little
Yeah.
bit more from the figures. And
Okay.
one of the challenges, the more colours you introduce, the harder it gets to be accessible, particularly when you think about colour blindness.
Yes,
So
yes. Yes,
I've
that's right.
put these through a couple of different bits of software to show me what it looks like for people with different types of colour blindness, and they seem to work. Although I'll sort of look forward to feedback on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do as a practice is not only do we use the colour, we also write, say, T3-A or T2-B.
Mm.
So we actually write it as well for colourblind. But anyway, so that's the change there. Then we have a new categorisation, and U is now X, and no more 1, 2, 3. So let's talk about root protection areas. Now, root protection areas are really they're not understood, they're known about by other professions. So you'll get the client, the planning officer, a planner, a landscape architect, an architect talking about root protection areas as a rigid thing. They'll say, oh, well, that's within the root protection area. And then it's our role as arboriculturalists to say, well, actually, part of that root protection area is currently occupied by a building, or there's a river on the other side. You know, there are things that we know that a tree wouldn't be rooting within if you just put a circle on a plan. So it seems to me that the committee have thought about this quite deeply and made it more nuanced. Would you? I think we're all dying to know. So tell
Yeah.
us, what are the changes to the root protection areas?
So I think you're absolutely right in that it is a term that other professions understand. They talk about root protection areas, sometimes referring to as root protection zones, but we all know what they're talking about. So I think for far too many projects that I've seen, root protection area is just a circle. And that awareness of what's happening on the site and where roots are likely to be is completely lost. So there's the sort of the design for a root protection area broadly splits into two elements. One is the shape, so understanding on site what factors might be affecting, influencing the distribution and pattern of roots. And then there's the size, which as currently is principally based on the diameter of the tree. And it's only a minor thing, and it's not the intention, but by moving from the 1.5 down to 1.3 metres, for some trees, it's going to give just a marginally bigger diameter, which might give a slightly bigger root protection area. It's quite marginal, but there could be a little bit of additional gain there for trees.
And the root protection area is not standard, is it, for each of the classifications?
No, so for the veteran trees and mature category A trees, the multiplier would be 15 times stem diameter. For veteran trees in particular, that would be uncapped, and that aligns with the work of David Lonsdale recommending that as a buffer. And where the canopy of the tree might be particularly large, it would be 5 metres beyond that, should that be greater.
So whichever is bigger, it's 15 times the stem diameter, or if it's got a really big canopy, then it's another 5 metres out of that, whichever is greater, but it is normally a big fat chunky trunk by definition really, and that isn't capped. So
Correct.
that could be a stem diameter of 2 metres, so that's 2 times 15, which equals 30. That's a 30-metre radius in any one direction. Let's say all things being equal, you can do a circle. And I wonder about the science of that, but perhaps we'll come on to that a bit later. So for A category trees, it's 15 times the stem diameter at 1.3 metres. Is that capped?
That's mature category A trees.
Mature only? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got to classify it as mature. So if it's
For which there is a definition for what a mature tree is now as well within the standard.
So for a mature category A tree, it's 15 times the stem diameter. Is that capped?
Yes, that's capped at 22.5 metres as an equivalent radius for a circle.
Great. So veterans are uncapped. So as fat as it is, the bigger the root protection area. And A's are capped. So for B and C, and also early mature and younger category A, is it still times 12?
So for all other trees that are alive, and there's a distinction because we've got an additional variation for trees that are dead, because there will be instances where The tree might be dead, but it wants to be. It should be retained for habitat, for conservation. So there's how they're protected is also included as a variation. But the 12 times stem diameter for other live trees.
So, what's the thinking behind the root protection area for X trees, for dead trees, not actually X trees, but dead trees? What is it we're looking to protect there?
So we effectively it's not really live roots because the trees are dead. So it's the structural root plate effectively that needs to be protected to avoid causing the tree to fall over. So that's it's a much smaller area than if it were for a live tree.
So we could, if we didn't have confidence about what that might be, and we could refer to Matek, has some good calculations, I believe, on that in his work. By the way, Klaus Matek, I want to interview you, and I don't know how to get hold of you. If any of the listeners know how I can get in contact with Klaus Matek, please could you DM me on LinkedIn. Going back to that, though, interesting with the retaining dead trees, their structural root plate, that makes a lot of sense. But I suppose some of the species that might be using that dead tree as habitat might be sensitive to disturbance and might want more of a buffer around them. But and anyway, I'm being pedantic there, but it's just an interesting point.
Mm.
Probably to me
It,
only.
it is an interesting point, but it also the 2012 standard doesn't require root protection areas for the category U trees.
No.
So if you've got a tree on adjoining land that's outside of the control of the developer, in theory it's got no protection, which surely wouldn't make sense. So
Yeah.
yeah,
No, that
even
is
the
really
category X trees
interesting.
need protection.
No, I had many a situation like that. So that is really interesting. And there's a really good diagram in one of the annexes of the
Mm.
British Standard version now, which shows a tree root spread and the RPO overlaid on it. I think that's a really powerful image, actually. So,
Yeah.
listeners, when you log on, as you will be, to make your observations, then do check out the image there. The other thing I observed actually in the document was about root protection areas is a referencing to various root investigation methods and how
Mm.
if you have that data, your root protection area should reflect that. Have I interpreted that correctly?
Yeah, it's in there as a note, but if you've got more detailed information, then absolutely use it. It's not saying everyone needs to go out there and do root radar and figure out where the roots are, but if you have information from root radar or from trial trenching, that should be used to help inform design.
Because the root
Yeah.
protection area is not saying where the roots are necessarily, because roots are highly adaptive, opportunistic things that will grow where they're getting the good stuff for the least effort. So I think those listeners who are new to this, this might be they may be at college or they may be listening in another country. We're not saying, are we, that the root protection area is definitively where the roots are. Perhaps you could remind listeners on what the point of the root protection area is in its very essence.
Yeah, so and it's good referencing that image in which the sort of root distribution as an example with root protection area is shown, because the root protection area is not pretending to be where all the roots for the tree are. Roots will almost certainly for most trees significantly go beyond that. But the root protection area is a minimum area required to keep that tree going, to keep it sort of the vitality of that tree. And it's not saying what you should do is dig up to the very edge of it. If you can protect more beyond it, then it's all the better. And then that's where, to some extent, the section around impact assessments touches on mitigation. So if part of the root protection area that's initially been drawn is impacted, then consider where else roots are around that tree and provide mitigation by extending elsewhere. So you've still got a total area of roots being protected.
And this is why the role of the arboriculturalist is critical, because we have that knowledge of species tolerance. It's a world of difference between an oak and a birch and their species tolerance to disturbance within the root protection area. I think the British standard in the last iteration and this current proposed revision talks about the nuances, and you can read it there, listeners.
And there is a list of different factors to consider with root protection area size. So while there is a formula put forward as a starting point, if the soil conditions or the site factors otherwise suggest to an arboriculturist actually this tree needs more space than that area would indicate, then that's what they should be putting forward. To rely solely on a formula is a little bit too simplistic.
Well,
But it needs to be a starting point.
Yeah, it's a starting point. I think everybody likes simplicity, don't they? And it's almost one of those, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, you know. Oh, I can go out and measure root protection areas, another might say. But it is more complex. It's interesting, though, we're talking here, I'm going to play devil's advocate with you about, let's say, a beech tree. Let's say an early mature beech tree, which is category A, but it's not really old enough to be a mature tree. And we calculate, let's say it has a stem diameter of 500 at 1.3 meters. So its root protection area is going to be a radius of a circle, all things being equal, of 6 meters. But we know that beech trees, say it's a chalky soil, so it's fairly shallow rooted. So the root protection area is 6 meters. We kind of know that root protection area may not be enough for that very sensitive tree. Roots of beech are highly sensitive. Beech show lots of effects of root compaction, Beech are highly sensitive and they show signs of damage if the soil's been compacted or root pruning, for example. And we know then that would be a really strong argument for allowing for a 1 metre buffer, I notice, is advocated within this document. Let's go the other way. Let's be controversial with an early mature oak tree of 500 millimetres stem diameter at 1.3, same root protection area, and something is happening on the edge of that root protection area. Could we ever, is the British standard saying that there could be a case made for reducing the root protection area, or at least shifting that root protection area? We talk about it being made larger. Could we argue that it could be made smaller under the current proposed British standard?
I'd say going smaller is where you start to become much more significant impact on the tree, because we're accepting already that there's loss of tree roots just by defining that root protection area. And it's really useful, that image in the annex, because it just reinforces actually the amount of damage that could be done to a tree is quite significant, with huge proportion, potentially the majority of the tree root system removed. So that minimum area of the root protection area really is the minimum. It could be changed in shape, potentially, if you're trenching and you slice off maybe half metre, 1 metre in one side, then you go, okay, we need to extend the root protection area and the area that's being protected elsewhere as mitigation. But there still needs to be that total area protected. And I've seen a number of reports in the past where a consultant sets out the root protection area for a tree, accepts there's work being done within it, and that's it. So, but surely that's not what I don't think the current British standard intends, and it's certainly not what the draft intends.
One of the biggest changes within this revised standard is the inclusion of canopy cover assessments. And I find it very clear on existing trees. First of all, what was your reasoning behind including tree canopy cover assessments? And what are you measuring? Why and how?
So I think one of the weaknesses of the current British standard is the impact assessment principally focuses on numbers of trees retained, removed, protected, and it doesn't really do justice to the values that trees provide and the benefits, the whole host of ecosystem services they provide. And in principle, larger trees provide more ecosystem service value. So the sort of the use of canopy cover is a proxy for that. And as a proxy, of course there are issues. It's not an absolute one for one, but it is something that is achievable with the information that's recorded.
So, canopy cover assessments, the other thing about them is they are widely understood, aren't they? Whereas ecosystem services provision, incredibly important. And wow, what a different place we are now from 2012 to 2024 in terms of the excellent work that's being carried out by lots of different organisations, like the iTree studies around the globe, and the wealth of data there is there, and the other data from financial evaluation of trees, such as CAVAT. But to the layman, what I like about canopy cover assessments is people intuitively understand it. So by canopy cover, you're talking about a bird's eye view looking down on a treed landscape. And you describe in the document how an individual tree will be measured, and northeast, southwest from your tree survey plan. Tell us about groups of overlapping trees.
So where there's groups of several trees together, there's the risk of double counting canopy cover. So the proposal is to measure plan view for canopy, so that there isn't double counting of trees. So if you've got several close together, and equally as part of the canopy cover projection, so that future modelling of their growth, that you're not double counting that equally. So it is very much the plan view of trees from the sky. I think there's a few local authorities in the last few years that have developed canopy cover policies, and I think it's a really positive sort of move forward, and like you say, it sort of aligns with something people can acknowledge and understand.
It is already in policy for the London Plan, policy GL7. Looks for that for major developments within London, and individual local authorities up and down the UK have this requirement, but very few. High Wycombe has its own method, and I this is really timely because there are a number of people, actually myself included, with Luke Fay, and we worked on this for a while, Project 4D Trees, and I know that there are other people as well who are working on this. We're kind of all having a go. I mean, sorry, no disrespect to the others. I'm sure we're very, very wonderful and worthy models, but I think people are craving some kind of consistency of approach. And the British Standard is very clear about how to measure the existing tree population. And it's very understandable. So what you're looking for then, I understand, is a canopy cover assessment of, we're talking about development sites here, the existing tree population before anything happens, the retained tree population, and how that might grow in year 0, which is the construction year, 10, 20, 30, and the loss of trees, and the canopy cover of the newly planted trees in accordance with the landscaping scheme, in year 0, 10, 20, 30. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then through doing that, it's possible to model the net benefit or disbenefit in relation to the tree population over time. So is canopy cover improving as a consequence of development? And I'd like to think it will encourage retention and protection of particularly large trees, those trees that provide the greatest benefits.
And so, in other words, I don't see this written down in the standard, but I think it's helpful. I think people like to latch on to a break even year. So, in other words, in what year after construction do we reach equivalent canopy cover? And that's also referenced in the Trees Design and Action Group first planning paper that they brought out. And there's a section on
Just
there.
on that, it's an interesting element because the British standard it sets out a process, so
Yeah,
it's not a policy document.
no.
But I'd certainly encourage local authorities to develop policies that can be sort of used in conjunction with the British standard, so it can use things like canopy cover to inform decision making.
So the purpose of putting it then in the British standard is to canopy cover is like a neat way of encapsulating in a very quite simplistic way of the multiple benefits that trees provide and an emphasis on big is better.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to ask you something. It's about the growth of trees. You talk about measuring the growth of trees, and there is a complex cross section of a tree looking at the angle of future branches. Could you
Mm.
could you expand upon first of all the different parameters that we should think about in terms of tree growth?
Yeah, so the I suppose just as a starting point is the annex with the detail about canopy cover is an informative annex, and it's something that not all readers necessarily appreciate is the difference between normative content of the British Standard, which effectively sets out what is required to claim compliance with the standard, and then informative content, which is there as a guide and as an aid. And one of the reasons that it is informative, and it's something I've been quite conscious of, is not wanting to stifle innovation or set a benchmark that after a short period of time is no longer necessarily entirely appropriate still, because things change over time. Research continues and we get a better understanding, a new understanding, a different perspective of trees over time. So it is set out as informative. So that's it's something I think that's worth noting. And I have seen some really good canopy cover reports, some using the forest research shoot extension growth information, but others based on their professional judgment of the tree as it is on the site, and that's perfectly valid, provided it's reasonable. Of course, you can't just say it's going to grow huge amounts.
Yeah.
So species is one of the key factors. Some trees put on much more shoot growth in a year than others. But equally the form of the tree. So more fastigiate columnar trees have a shorter radial crown extension, despite potentially having quite long shoot growth through the year. And the opposite to that, I suppose, is weeping willow growing down, very long shoot extension, but radially it could be quite slow increment. So that's certainly one of the key factors to consider is species and the form of the tree. It may well be that the site conditions, soil, the hydrology, the drainage, exposure could also affect canopy growth and things like buildings, utilities, overhead cables, where pruning may be required on a regular basis, or even for some street trees, they might be on a regular pruning cycle and they're always being kept to a regulated size. So there's a number of different factors.
And in terms of newly planted trees, it's really useful that we've got the British Standard BS 8545 on tree retention. I've forgotten the title. This is a blooper
Trees
which we're going to
from,
keep in. Go on then. What is it, Howard?
well, that's testing me now. It's trees from nursery to independence in the landscape.
That's it. Brilliant. I do refer to it all the time in my 5837 reports. So it refers to that. So basically, if you're planting a tree, you've got to look after it well, and let's hope it isn't vandalised, and all of those different parameters. But I'm going to come back again. We have all these different parameters, and that's right and proper. It's interesting how far a British Standard document could and should go. Because I like the fact that you say there's room for creativity and innovation, and that's absolutely important. And it isn't the role of a British Standard to be totally prescriptive on methodology. It should set standards for, let's say, tree surveying for the British BS 5837. But I do feel we're still at a stage where the scientific data lags behind the thirst for use of the application of it, and in particular modelling tree growth of newly planted trees. And I do feel that with all these multiple parameters, it can be a bit overwhelming, and many ARBs may not have carried out a canopy cover assessment before, and now it is part of the British Standard should this be adopted. It'd be interesting to know what people think. So let's say it is adopted, it's included in the 2025 revision, which will be coming out. People need to know how to project the growth. Now, I use another paper by Forest Research, which I'm going to put on LinkedIn. But I wonder, I'd be interested to know what people's feedback will be through this process on whether they feel they need more guidance on how those existing trees and newly planted trees will go. It's going to be really interesting, isn't it, Howard?
It absolutely is. And for new trees, young trees, the reference I often go to is Hilly's Design Guide, and it sets out snapshots over, I think it's 25 and 30 years of how large those trees might be. So there's different bits of information out there from different sources.
Yeah, the paper I
But there's
use.
one thing that we shouldn't forget is professional ability, professional knowledge.
Yes.
We're not we shouldn't put ourselves in that sort of bucket of just looking at lists and looking up spreadsheets. We're we we're arboriculturists and we are the professions for tree.
Oh, I love that. Yes, we are. We are arboriculturalists, and we should never feel overwhelmed that we have to rely on data because we have our own knowledge and experience. So that's a great point. There is something I did pick up on, though, and ask you to explain. Maybe it was in the 2012 and I missed it. You say somewhere, I'm going to find it. Yes, I've got it here. 5.5.1. The tree survey should be carried out by an arboriculturalist. What is the thinking behind the word should and not must?
It's a good question, and it's come up a number of times. So the British standards, I suppose, in a nutshell, for this type of standard, there are three types of standard that could be used. A specification, which sets out what absolutely is required, and that's where the reference to must could be used. So a specification is really sort of, you're held to do that, and to claim compliance is non-negotiable. There's a code of practice which sets out recommendations, and the normative reference there is should.
Okay.
And that's the reason why, to some extent, my hands are tied. But
Yes.
the next guide, sort of level below that, is a guide, as a British standard. And it just on that, the title has changed from recommendations to code of practice, but that has not changed its level. It's
Okay.
always been a code of practice. It's just been referenced as recommendations for I'm not too sure why.
Okay. So the standard of the British standard is that if it is recommendations or code of practice, which we've just talked about, so seems to me we're in the middle band. Is that a simple way of saying it?
Yeah,
So if
yeah,
you're in the middle band, you can't use the word must.
correct.
Okay, so
Yeah,
that's the British. That's
and
that's the BS of the British standard. I'm not going to say any more on that
yeah,
point.
it's well, I was just going to say on that point, and it's come up from a few people, is deviation from the British
Yeah,
standard. Can you not follow a recommendation? And it sets out at the very start that deviation from the British standard is acceptable, provided you can claim that you are meeting the same or a better standard.
interesting. No, that's good because it gives freedom of expression and freedom of exploration, providing it's for the
Mm.
good of trees and planning
Yeah.
and construction. Interesting. Right, so you've used should because the BS computer says no if you use must. Is that it in a nutshell?
Oh, blimey! You've
I'm
you've you've
awful, aren't I?
you've
You don't have
blown
to
me there,
answer
but
that. I've said it for you. Don't answer that, Howard. That's all right.
but they yeah, there are rules for a good reason,
Okay.
and it
Are
is
there?
it's
Yeah, rules to
the
be
British
broken.
standard drafting. The British standard drafting process is very robust.
Okay. I'm not gonna make you say anything about that. I've been a shock jock on that
It's
one.
robust for a
Yeah.
good
Yeah,
reason.
yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Okay. Let's talk about something very simple now. You've you one of the other changes which I've looked at, which seems very straightforward and reflects the times, is another alternative method of physically protecting trees on sites. What's the new
Yeah,
addition?
so they sort of introduced a couple of additional drawings, and it's worth referencing the drawings are all going to be, while the copyright will be owned by the British standards, they can all be reused effectively, and that's set out at the start of the British standard. So they can be used within contracts as parts of specifications or examples of how things should be done. And going back to that root protection area image, I think it's really powerful, and just showing that to designers will make them actually think, oh, blimey, yeah, that RPA is more than I thought it was.
Mm,
The implications are greater than
mm,
I originally thought. So for tree protection, for many, many years, pressure on space on development sites. And the standard tree protection fence at the edge of the root protection area is not always achievable. Quite often work ends up happening within that root protection area. And that's one of the reasons why the term construction exclusion zone has been dropped, because
mm,
far too often construction activity ends up happening there. But with things like ground protection in place, and there's two new images, one with effectively sort of the equivalent of site hoarding
mm,
placed up to and around trees, which could be used to physically protect above ground, provided the ground is equally being protected. And that might be in a highway situation where you've got a road and a carriageway. To fence all of that off as a root protection area, if there's no activity, simply doesn't make sense. And then we've equally another image which has stem protection and branch protection, where almost as a last resort, but there will be instances where perhaps minor civil works, where you're excavating all the way around a tree to replace paving, and you want to protect the stem of the tree, and that could be done effectively by wrapping the tree.
No, they're very clear diagrams within the British Standard, and providing you acknowledge your copyright, they can be widely used in reports. Now, talking of reports, I've been writing arboricultural impact assessments for the last 12 years, AIAs. How is that changing?
So I've heard a couple of people mention this. It's like, oh, you can't change the name of it. And so starting point is it's a draft for consultation, and genuinely ears are open and listening. So all the comments that get put into the BSI standards development website, every single comment will be looked at and considered. So all ears. The reason for the change, perhaps too subtle, but assessment is an ongoing, quite often iterative process. So the assessment occurs, and you're sort of establishing what's happening, and you're providing feedback to the designer, and that whole assessment process is not necessarily just a report. So the end product, and I've seen them called different things elsewhere. I've seen them arboricultural planning reports, arboricultural impact reports, just arboricultural reports, a whole host of different names for what is commonly referenced as an arboricultural impact assessment. So there is some rationale behind that, but assessment, in a nutshell, is the process.
So
And the
tell us
output
about
of that is the report.
and tell us about the content of that assessment that you propose in the revision.
So there's arboricultural impact assessment split into two levels. There's one which is looking at the arboricultural feature, and people who read it will pick up quite quickly that the term arboricultural feature is widely used through the document as a cover-all, because sometimes it's trees and groups of trees, or groups, trees, woodlands, hedgerows. So for ease of use, arboricultural features is the sort of the common term used through the standard. So there's the assessing the impact at that arboricultural feature level. So how's the root protection area affected? Is anything happening near the tree? Is there any pruning activity? And for some it's going to be even, is the tree retained, is it removed? So very much at that tree level. And then the second layer of impact assessment is that macro impact. So what's the total impact? So that might be happening to that tree, this tree's going, that's staying. What is that total impact? And that's assessed through the canopy cover. So how does canopy cover change over time? But also an understanding of the population dynamics. So is there good, I say good in a broad sense, but healthy populations tend to be dynamic, diverse. So many sites, particularly sites with many trees, you'd want a diverse population of species as an end product, with variety of age classes as well. So you got a more sustainable population of trees as an end product. So that's where that assessment or summary of the impact on population sits as well.
Yep, great. So the canopy cover assessments that some people will be doing for the first time form part of the arboricultural impact report as the revisions currently stands. So what kind of plans will we have in our arboricultural impact report are you proposing? Any new plans?
Yeah, it's new. For some it might be new, but it's effectively it's an impact plan. So an arboricultural impact plan that sets out what is happening on the site, what trees are retained, what are removed, and that could be the same as a tree protection plan. But tree protection plan I'd see as showing the retained features and how they're protected, not necessarily all of the impacts for trees that are removed as well.
So some people, myself included, on a complex site will do a separate plan showing tree removal and retention.
Yep.
And then another plan showing, and that might also show demolition tree protection as well. And then another plan for the construction phase showing retained tree arboricultural features and the proposed development and tree protection measures and where method statement should apply, and then a third plan for the external works phase. I'm thinking that there might also, and I'm pondering, and I don't expect you to answer this, that there might also be a canopy cover plan for years 10, 20, and 30 of the growth rate of retained and planted trees as well. It's going to be a
Yeah,
more
and there is.
complex document, isn't it?
Yeah, so the constraints and opportunities plan, and that it's introducing opportunities. So it's not just a tree constraints plan, but
Mm-hmm.
opportunities, and that the intention is the canopy cover over time is shown on there, so designers can understand over time what are the implications for locating different features across the site, and then that would inform the impact plan. So it would include the canopy cover, and there is an example of how canopy cover could be shown in one of the
Yes.
annexes.
Yes, there is. Okay. And so this makes for a bigger document and more work for arboricultural consultants and potentially, I'm surmising, I don't know.
So potentially, there'll be some already doing quite a bit of this.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And potentially more work for arboricultural officers as well and local authorities. I mean, that's not, I'm not saying if that's positive or negative. Obviously, the more detail, the more that we can help our tree population and serve our communities, the better. Now, also, I note in the current revision, it's helpfully very clear about at what stage a detailed arboricultural method statement can be produced. Could you just talk to that for a bit, please?
yeah, and I've been guilty of it in the past, is putting forward an arboricultural method statement that doesn't really cover all the details on the site because construction compound isn't known or details of how something might be excavated isn't fully understood. Um, so there's differentiation between that preliminary arboricultural method statement and something that's much more comprehensive when design is understood. I think it was, and it came up from a number of people saying the current standard referring to a heads of terms method statement was sort of confusing and it wasn't clear what that intended. So hopefully I've sort of put that to bed.
Yeah, okay. So what you're essentially saying is an arboricultural method statement or the revision proposal is saying that a arboricultural method statement couldn't really be reasonably produced in detail normally until post-planning as part of planning condition discharge. So it may result in some local authorities no longer requiring that upfront. Something I've always personally argued that cannot be provided upfront
Mm.
other than very special circumstances with unique small sites. Great.
Yeah, there will be situations where the local planning authority wants assurance that it is actually constructible. And that's where the preliminary AMS can at least say out the principles and the sort of the boundaries of what's expected.
Is there anything else within the proposed revision that I haven't raised yet that you would like to elaborate on?
I think I'm gonna touch on it, and I might regret this, but it's BMG.
Well,
So
this
it
go on.
is,
This has got my interest now.
yeah. So it's not really mentioned directly, and there's a number of different reasons for that. So Standards are always subordinate to law. Law takes priority, and in England at least, BNG is statute law. So that takes priority of whatever the British standard may say. And to avoid confusion between what is part of the standard and what is requirement by law, it is intentionally sort of not in there to avoid that confusion. Additionally, some things that also need to be considered with B&G and its inclusion or reference to it is that in England, where it is live, within 2 to 3 years, it's likely to have some form of revision. How much, no one knows. But that 2 to 3 years would be within the lifespan of the proposed standard. So the proposed standard, if it were referencing B&G specifically, could then be out of date. It's in England, it's not in Scotland. Scotland is developing something, and that might look quite different to what England has. So there's regional variations that then, how do they get sort of worked in? And BNG is for projects that go through the planning framework. The British standard, yes, a lot of it goes through planning, but there's huge amounts where it's used in relation to permitted developments, where BNG is not required. So to then build it in as a requirement when it might not be needed on a project also creates sort of further confusion. So there's lots of potential for introducing lots of confusion. But we have through the drafting for trees, stem diameter 1.3 metres above ground level aligns with what BNG in England is looking for. We know from the species that we're recording, which I'd like to think we know at least, whether they're native or not, which is one of the condition factors. Other condition factors around canopy cover, whether the tree is mature or not, they're already being recorded. And we've included as part of the tree survey a note on the ground conditions, which again aligns with one of the condition factors for BNG, whether or not 20% below the canopy is vegetated. So there's quite a lot, while not directly referencing BNG, that does align with at least what England is looking for at the moment.
Interesting, because BNG is the talk of the town, as it were, and it felt like a glaring omission. So, Howard, how can people take part in this consultation, make their views known?
Yeah. So the live consultation till the 16th of October can be accessed through the BSI's Standards Development website. So if people go into Google, type in BSI Standards Development, they'd need to create an account to view. It takes about a minute, so it's a really quick, simple registration process, and then you can view the British Standard in all of the text and add comments to all of the different clauses. The comments are aligned with each specific clause or sub-clause, and that's it helps, I think, those making comments be specific to those particular points, but it certainly helps me and the rest of the drafting panel, because we can then look at all of those comments together in the whole from different people and address the different parts of the standard as we go through comment resolution. Which, fingers crossed, we're looking for April 2025 as a publication date, but that's subject to the volume and difficulty of some of the comments that might be raised.
So, what we do know is our arboricultural community is passionate. You know, they really care about this, and we all have opinions. Many of us work on our own, and we've all got something to say. So, I urge the listener, don't moan, take part. Go onto your internet search engine, put in BSI 5837, I did it earlier to prepare for this interview, quickly registered, and actually it's a really simple process. And your views matters, listeners, to help the team to distill all of the comments, to produce a document for you for the betterment of trees, development and construction, because I think we're well overdue this. And I just want to really thank you, Howard, and the committee members for giving up so much of your free time. You do this for nothing. You know, there's no plaudits. There might be a few custard pies thrown, but you're doing it for the love of trees. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you also for taking part in this interview. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to reach your huge audience as well.